This is the third video in our Genesis series. In the first two videos, we walked through the creation of the world, the garden, the breath of God entering human lungs for the first time, and then the moment everything changed. The serpent, the fruit, the exile from Eden. Tonight, we step outside the garden entirely. Chapter 4 is where the consequences of that exile begin to play out in real human lives, in real human relationships. It is the story of two brothers, Cain and Abel, and what happens when worship goes wrong and jealousy is left unchecked. It is one of the most psychologically rich passages in the entire Bible, and it is much stranger and much more layered than most people realize. If you are new here, we break every passage down three ways: historically, literally, and spiritually, because the Bible means more than one thing at once, and none of those layers should be skipped. Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Historical context. This chapter describes the first generation born outside the Garden of Eden, and it reflects the harsh transition from a world of divine provision to a world of human production. In the ancient Near East, the birth of a firstborn son was the most significant event in a family's history. The firstborn was the heir, the one who would carry on the father's name and maintain the family's land and cultic duties. When Eve gives birth to Cain, her exclamation in Genesis chapter 4 verse 1 reflects a massive theological shift. In the previous chapters, God was the one who made or formed life. Here, Eve uses the word kanithi, which means I have gotten or I have acquired. She is asserting her role as a co-creator with the Lord. This reflects a historical period where human agency was beginning to be viewed as the primary driver of civilization. The occupations of the two brothers in Genesis chapter 4 verse 2 represent the two pillars of ancient Near Eastern society: pastoralism and agriculture. This was a classic historical tension known as the conflict between the desert and the sown. Abel is a shepherd, representing the nomadic or semi-nomadic life of those who kept flocks and moved with the seasons. Cain is a farmer, representing the settled life of those who worked the soil. In Mesopotamia and Canaan, these two groups were often in competition for land, water, and social status. There are ancient Sumerian poems, such as the debate between the shepherd god Dumuzi and the farmer god Enkidu, which mirror this exact situation. In those myths, the gods often have to decide which lifestyle is more pleasing or valuable. For an ancient audience, the story of Cain and Abel was not just a family drama. It was a cosmic commentary on the very foundations of their economy and way of life. The concept of an offering in Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, is deeply rooted in the ritual practices of the ancient world. In the 15th century before Christ, giving a portion of one's labor to a deity was a standard way of maintaining the covenant and ensuring future prosperity. It was a form of tribute to the great king. The text notes that Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil, while Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. In ancient sacrificial systems, the fat was considered the most choice and flavorful part of the animal, reserved exclusively for the deity. The firstborn was also the most valuable, representing the best of the womb. Historically, Abel's offering followed the highest standards of the time for a blood sacrifice. The debate over why Cain's offering was rejected often ignores this historical reality. In the context of ancient rituals, the quality and the priority of the gift were the primary indicators of the giver's heart. Abel gave his best and his first. Cain simply brought some fruit. The warning God gives to Cain in Genesis chapter 4 verse 7 contains a fascinating historical reference to Mesopotamian demonology. When God says sin is crouching at your door, he uses the word for sin in a way that personifies it as a predator. The Hebrew word for crouching is related to the Akkadian word, rabisu. In the ancient Near East, the rabisu was a literal demon known as the croucher, who waited at the thresholds of houses, waiting for a person to make a moral or ritual mistake so it could pounce. By using this imagery, the author of Genesis is speaking the language of the time. He is warning Cain that his anger has created an opening for a destructive force that is lurking like a wild animal. In the historical mindset of the Israelites, the door or the threshold was a spiritually vulnerable place that had to be guarded. God is telling Cain that he has the royal authority to rule over this croucher, but only if he chooses to do what is right. Finally, the names of the two brothers carry historical weight that would have been obvious to an ancient listener. Cain, or Cain, sounds like the word for smith or spear, hinting at the later development of metalworking and violence in his lineage. Abel, or Hebel, literally means breath or vapor. In the wisdom literature of the ancient world, a breath was a symbol for something that is fleeting and temporary. From the very beginning of the story, the audience is historically tipped off that Abel's life will be short and substantial, only in its spiritual impact, while Cain's life will be defined by what he can acquire and build. This sets up the central conflict of the chapter, the struggle between the breathing life of faith and the acquiring life of self-reliance. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, the text describes the first birth in human history. After Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, they begin the work of building a family. The verse says Eve became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. Her exclamation is fascinating when you look at the original Hebrew. She says, "I have brought forth a man with the help of the Lord." The word for brought forth is konethi, which comes from the root word kana. This verb means to acquire, to possess, or to create. In a literal sense, Eve is making a linguistic connection between the name Cain and her own act of acquisition. She sees this child as something she has gained or produced. The phrase "with the help of the Lord" uses the particle eth, which can also be translated as with. This suggests Eve viewed herself as a direct partner with the Creator in bringing this new life into the world. In Genesis chapter 4 verse 2, the narrative introduces Abel. His name in Hebrew is Hebel, which literally translates to breath, vapor, or vanity. This is the same word used extensively in the book of Ecclesiastes to describe the fleeting nature of life This creates a sharp literal contrast between the two brothers. Cain's name is about acquisition and possession, while Abel's name is about transience. The text then defines their vocations. Abel is a roetzon, which means a feeder or keeper of sheep. Cain is an obed-adamah, which literally means a servant of the ground. This terminology is important because in Genesis chapter 2, the man was placed in the garden to serve it. Cain has taken up the mantle of the original human calling, but he is doing so on ground that has been cursed. Genesis chapter 4 verses 3 and 4 describe the first religious ritual. The phrase "in the course of time" literally translates as "at the end of days." This suggests that the offerings were not a random act, but occurred at a specific, appointed time, likely at the end of a harvest season. Cain brings an offering of the fruit of the ground. The text does not use any descriptive adjectives for Cain's gift. It is simply some fruit. In contrast, Abel brings the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. The mention of fat portions, or cheleb, is crucial. In the later Levitical law, the fat was considered the richest part of the sacrifice and belonged solely to God. By noting that Abel brought the firstborn and the fat, the text literally emphasizes that Abel gave the priority and the highest quality to the Lord. In Genesis chapter 4 verse 5, the literal reaction of God is described using the word shah, translated as looked with favor. It literally means to gaze at or to pay close attention to. God gazed at Abel's offering, but he did not gaze at Cain's. This caused a physical change in Cain. The text says he was very angry and his face was downcast. The Hebrew for downcast face literally means his face fell. This describes the visible sagging of the features that happens when someone is consumed by resentment and shame. Cain's internal state became visible on his skin. Genesis chapter 4 verses 6 and 7 record God's interrogation. God asks why Cain's face has fallen. He then offers a condition. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? The word for accepted is seat, which means a lifting up. It is a direct literal antonym to Cain's fallen face. If Cain does right, his face will be lifted. However, if he does not, sin is crouching at the door. The word for crouching is robert. In Hebrew grammar, this is a participle, describing a constant active state of lurking. Sin is personified as a wild beast. The verse concludes by saying sin desires to have you, but you must rule over it. The word for rule is mashal, the same word used for human dominion over the earth in the creation account. Literally, Cain is being told that his primary territory to conquer is not the soil, but his own heart. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual journey of Genesis chapter 4 begins with a subtle but dangerous shift in perspective found in Eve's words. When she says, "I have gotten a man," she is expressing a sense of spiritual pride. After the exile from the garden, the focus has shifted from God's provision to human production. Spiritually, this sets the stage for Cain's character. He is the son of acquisition. This teaches us that when we view our children, our work, or our successes as things we have possessed, rather than gifts we have received, we move into a dangerous spiritual territory of self-sufficiency. The difference between the two brothers' offerings provides the most enduring spiritual lesson in the passage. For centuries, people have asked why God liked Abel's gift and not Cain's. The spiritual answer is found in the concept of priority. Abel brought the firstborn and the fat. He gave God the first and the best. Cain brought some fruit. Spiritually, Cain's offering was a matter of convenience, while Abel's was a matter of devotion. This teaches us that God is not interested in the material value of what we give, but in the position he holds in our hearts. A spiritual life built on leftovers will never lead to the gaze of God's favor. God's conversation with Cain in Genesis chapter 4 verses 6 and 7 is a profound example of divine grace. Even though Cain has a bad heart and a rejected offering, God does not abandon him. He comes to him and asks questions. This reveals that God is a spiritual counselor who wants us to examine our own motives. The fallen face of Cain is a spiritual barometer. When we feel resentment, in anger, or a sense of being rejected by God, we are invited to look at our own actions. God's question, "Why are you angry?" is designed to lead Cain to repentance before his anger turns into something irreversible. The description of sin as something crouching at the door is one of the most powerful spiritual metaphors in the Bible. It teaches us that sin is an opportunistic force. It does not just happen. It waits for a moment of weakness, like Cain's anger, to pounce. Spiritually, our emotions are the doors to our souls. If we leave the door of anger open, sin will crouch there. This passage warns us that we cannot play with our resentment without attracting the predator. The spiritual life requires a constant guarding of the threshold of the heart. The final command to rule over sin is the ultimate statement of human moral agency. God tells Cain that he is not a victim of his impulses or his circumstances. He has been given the spiritual authority to master his internal world. This teaches us that while sin is powerful and desires to have us, it is not sovereign. Through the strength given by God, we can rule over the crouching beast of our own dark inclinations. The spiritual tragedy of Cain is not that he felt angry, but that he refused to use his God-given authority to master that anger. It serves as a permanent reminder that the most important battle we will ever fight is the one that happens at the door of our own will. Genesis chapter 4, verses 8 through 16. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Historical context. The narrative of Genesis chapter 4, verses 8 through 16, moves from the ritual space of the altar to the lawless space of the open field. In the ancient Near East of the 2nd millennium before Christ, the field or the sadeh was a specific legal and social category. Unlike the city or the home, the field was an unobserved area where witnesses were few and the protection of the community was thin. In ancient legal codes like the laws of Eshnunna or the Code of Hammurabi, a crime committed in the field was often handled differently because it lacked the immediate accountability of the town square. By inviting Abel out to the field, Cain is not just suggesting a walk, he is historically and strategically choosing a location where he believes the eye of justice cannot see him. This marks the first premeditated criminal act in the biblical record, utilizing the geography of the ancient world to facilitate a betrayal of the most sacred bond. The dialogue between God and Cain in Genesis chapter 4 verse 9 reflects the tribal justice systems of the 15th century before Christ. In a world without a centralized police force or a formal state judiciary, the safety of an individual depended entirely on the kinship group. The concept of being a keeper or a guardian was the fundamental glue of ancient society. If a man went missing, the responsibility to find him or avenge him fell on his nearest male relative. Cain's sarcastic response, "Am I my brother's keeper?" is a historical rejection of the very foundation of tribal life. He is essentially declaring himself a sovereign individual with no duty to his kin. This would have been seen by an ancient audience as an act of radical social anarchy. In their eyes, Cain was not just a murderer. He was someone who had dismantled the basic contract of human survival. The imagery of blood crying out from the ground in Genesis chapter 4 verse 10 connects to deep-seated ancient Near Eastern beliefs about the nature of life and death. In Mesopotamian and Canaanite cultures, the blood was synonymous with the soul or the life force. When blood was shed unjustly, it was believed to pollute the land itself. Unavenged blood was thought to cry out for justice, often taking the form of a ghost or a spirit that would haunt the community until the debt was paid. By stating that Abel's blood cries out to him, the Lord is asserting his role as the ultimate avenger of blood. This historically established Yahweh as the one who hears the cries of the oppressed, even when there are no human witnesses. It also suggests that the ground, which had already been cursed in the previous chapter, has now been further desecrated by the first human death. The sentence of being a restless wanderer in Genesis chapter 4 verse 12 describes the most severe social punishment possible in the ancient world. Exile. To be driven from the ground and forced to wander meant being stripped of your land, your family, and your legal protection. In a world where your identity was tied to your soil and your clan, being a wanderer was a form of living death. Cain's fear in verse 14 that whoever finds me will kill me reflects the historical reality of the blood feud. Without a clan to protect him, anyone who encountered Cain would have the right, and perhaps the perceived duty, to kill him as an outlaw. This highlights the paradox of Cain's situation. He killed his brother to secure his own status, but in doing so, he became the most vulnerable man on earth. Finally, the mark of Cain in Genesis chapter 4 verse 15 is one of the most historically misunderstood symbols in the Bible. In modern culture, it is often viewed as a brand of shame or a sign of a curse. However, in the context of the ancient Near East, the mark was a protective device. In a society where tribal marks, tattoos, or specific hairstyles were used to identify a person's group and their protector, the mark of Cain served as a royal decree of immunity. It was a visible sign that Cain was under the direct protection of the Lord God. This historically mirrors the practice of a king granting a safe passage symbol to a subject. The mark did not say, "This man is a murderer." It said, "Do not touch this man, or you will answer to the King of the universe." It was an act of divine restraint, designed to stop the cycle of vengeance from consuming the entire human race. Literal breakdown. Genesis chapter 4 verse 8 begins with a conversation that the Masoretic text famously leaves incomplete, but many ancient translations include the phrase, "Let us go out to the field." The word for field is sada, which refers to an uncultivated, open expanse. Literarily, the movement from the cultivated altar to the wild field represents a transition from the place of order to the place of chaos. The verb for killed is harag, a term often used for a violent, intentional slaying. It is a blunt, final word that marks the end of the first human life. In Genesis chapter 4 verse 9, we see a literal echo of God's interrogation of Adam. God asks, "Where is your brother Abel?" Using the same interrogative particle I found in the question, "Where are you?" in the previous chapter. Cain's response is a flat denial. "I do not know." He follows this with the famous question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" The word for keeper is shoma, the same word used in chapter 2, when the man was told to keep the garden. Literarily, Cain is using a play on words to suggest that his vocation as a farmer does not include the guarding of people. Genesis chapter 4 verse 10 introduces the concept of audible blood. God says, "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." The Hebrew word for blood is damim, which is plural, often used to denote a violent death or the shedding of a great deal of blood. The word for cries out is tsuakim, which implies a shriek or a piercing scream for justice. The ground, or Adamah, is again a central character. It is personified as a witness that has been forced to consume something it was never meant to hold. The sentence in Genesis chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, is a literal expansion of the curse of the previous chapter. While Adam's ground was cursed with thorns, Cain is cursed from the ground. The land that he served, the Adamah, is now his enemy. It will no longer give its coach or its strength to him. This forces Cain into the status of a nawanad, a restless wanderer. These two Hebrew words describe someone who is constantly moving and swaying, unable to find a literal or psychological place of rest. Cain's reaction in Genesis chapter 4 verses 13 and 14 is focused entirely on his own survival. He says, "My punishment is more than I can bear." The word for punishment is avon, which can mean iniquity, guilt, or the consequence of sin. Literally, Cain is complaining that the weight of his guilt and the severity of his sentence are too heavy for him. He identifies three literal losses: the land, the presence of God, and his personal safety. He recognizes that, as an exile, he is now fair game for any avenger. In Genesis chapter 4 verse 15, God responds with a literal safeguard. He declares that anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. 7 is the biblical number of completion and perfection, suggesting that the retribution would be absolute. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain. The word for mark is ot, which literally means a sign, a signal, or a token. This is the same word used later for the rainbow, or the sign of the covenant. It was not a physical branding of shame, but a visible sign of divine protection. Genesis chapter 4 verse 16 concludes this literal movement with Cain leaving the Panim, or the face of the Lord. He settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Nod is not a geographical name in the usual sense. It is a literal noun derived from the word for wandering. Cain settles in the land of wandering. By moving east, and he is moving further away from the original garden, continuing the human trajectory of exile and distance from the sacred center. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual crisis in Genesis chapter 4, verse 8, is the movement from religious jealousy to physical violence. It teaches us that when our spiritual relationship with God is broken, our social relationships with others will inevitably follow. Cain could not strike God for rejecting his offering, so he struck the one who reflected God's favor. This reveals a profound spiritual warning. If we do not master our resentment toward God, we will eventually vent it on those around us. The field is the spiritual space where we act out the dark impulses we have nurtured at the altar. Cain's question in Genesis chapter 4, verse 9, "Am I my brother's keeper?" is the ultimate spiritual expression of the anti-covenant. While the spiritual life is built on the foundation of being our brother's keeper, the life of sin is built on the foundation of radical isolation. By denying his responsibility for Abel, Cain is spiritually declaring that he is the center of the universe. This teaches us that the first step away from God is the belief that we owe nothing to our neighbor. To be a follower of God is to accept the spiritual burden of guarding the life and dignity of those around us. The screaming blood in Genesis chapter 4, verse 10 reminds us that there are no private sins in the eyes of God. We may kill in the field where no one sees, but the very earth itself bears witness. Spiritually, this tells us that justice is built into the fabric of creation. The moral order of the universe is so sensitive that the shedding of innocent blood causes a cosmic disturbance. It teaches us that God is the spiritual listener who hears the cries of those who have no voice left to speak. We cannot silence the truth by silencing the person. The curse of restlessness in Genesis chapter 4, verses 11 and 12 is a spiritual description of the human heart apart from God. When we break the laws of love, we lose our place in the world. We become spiritually homeless, wandering from one distraction to another, unable to find the rest that only comes from a clear conscience. Cain's inability to get the soil to produce for him is a spiritual metaphor for the fruitlessness of a life built on violence. When we act in anger, even our hard work becomes a hollow exercise that yields no true satisfaction. Cain's complaint in Genesis chapter 4, verse 13 reveals a spiritual heart that is sorry for its punishment, but not for its sin. He does not weep for Abel. He weeps for himself. This is a crucial spiritual distinction. True repentance focuses on the harm done to others and the offense against God. But Cain-like sorrow focuses only on the personal cost of getting caught. It warns us that we can be spiritually devastated by the consequences of our actions without ever being spiritually transformed by the gravity of our guilt. The mark of Cain in Genesis chapter 4, verse 15 is one of the most beautiful spiritual paradoxes in the Bible. Even for a murderer and a liar, God provides protection. The mark is a spiritual sign of common grace. It tells us that God is committed to preserving life, even the lives of those who have devalued it. It teaches us that vengeance belongs to God alone, and he will not allow the cycle of human violence to execute his judgment. The mark is a spiritual stop sign to human blood feuds, showing that God's mercy extends even to the land of Nod. Finally, Cain's departure from the presence of the Lord in Genesis chapter 4, verse 16 is the ultimate spiritual tragedy. To live in Nod is to live in a state of perpetual spiritual displacement. By moving east of Eden, Cain is attempting to build a life where he is the king and the judge. This teaches us that the greatest punishment for sin is not physical pain or even wandering, but the loss of the face of God. We are spiritually designed to live in the gaze of the Creator. To turn away from that gaze is to enter a land of shadows where we are always moving but never arriving. Genesis chapter 4, verses 17 through 24. Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael was the father of Methusael, and Methusael was the father of Lamech. Lamech married 2 women, one named Ada and the other Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play stringed instruments and pipes. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, "Listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Historical context. The genealogy of Cain in Genesis chapter 4, verses 17 through 24, serves as a historical record of the birth of human civilization. In the 15th century before Christ, the Israelites would have understood this passage as the origin story for the world they saw around them, a world of walled cities, complex music, advanced metallurgy, and evolving social structures. This section tracks the rapid development of the human race as it moved further away from the pastoral simplicity of Eden and into the technological sophistication of the early Bronze Age. Historically, this mirrors the archaeological transition known as the Neolithic Revolution, where humans shifted from nomadic wandering to settled urban life. The building of the first city in Genesis chapter 4 verse 17 is a massive historical milestone. In the ancient Near East, the city, or the IR, was a symbol of security and defiance. The earliest cities like Eridu and Uruk in Mesopotamia were built with massive walls and irrigation systems to protect against both human enemies and the unpredictable forces of nature. For a man like Cain, who had been sentenced to be a restless wanderer, building a city was a direct historical attempt to overturn his divine sentence. He was trying to create a permanent, fortified place for himself. In ancient Sumerian king lists, the first cities were believed to have been lowered from heaven by the gods. Genesis counters this by attributing the first city to the hand of a man who was fleeing from God. It suggests that urbanization began not as a divine gift, but as a human survival strategy rooted in fear and the need for self-protection. The emergence of specialized professions in the family of Lamech reflects the historical stratification of ancient society. Jabal is identified as the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. This represents the formalized pastoralism that was the backbone of the Levant's economy. His brother Jubal is the father of music, specifically the lyre and the pipe. In the 15th century before Christ, music was not just entertainment. It was a critical part of temple worship, royal courts, and military communication. The lyre, or kinnah, was a sophisticated stringed instrument found in royal tombs throughout Ur and Egypt. Historically, this tells us that the Canaanite civilization was not just functional, but also aesthetically developed. They were creating high-end culture, even as they moved further from the Creator. The most significant technological leap is found in Tubal-Cain, who forged tools of bronze and iron in Genesis chapter 4, verse 22. This places the narrative in the transition between the Chalcolithic and the Bronze Age. The ability to smelt copper and tin into bronze changed the nature of farming and warfare forever. While the mention of iron suggests a later Iron Age refinement in the 15th century before Christ, iron was often meteoritic and considered more valuable than gold. Historically, the smith was a powerful and often feared figure in ancient society because he held the secrets of fire and metal. Tubal-Cain represents the historical moment when humanity gained the power to shape the earth into weapons and tools, giving them a level of control over their environment that was previously unimaginable. Finally, the character of Lamech in Genesis chapter 4, verses 19 through 24, introduces the historical development of polygamy and the escalation of the blood feud. Lamech is the first man in the Bible to take 2 wives, breaking the monogamous pattern established in the Garden of Eden. In the ancient Near East, multiple wives were often a sign of wealth and power, but they also introduced complex legal and inheritance issues. Lamech's poem, known historically as the Sword Song, is one of the oldest pieces of poetry in the Bible. It reflects a culture of extreme honor-shame and disproportionate revenge. In the tribal laws of the time, the lex talionis, or eye for an eye, was actually a way to limit revenge. Lamech's historical boast that he will be avenged 77 times shows a man who has placed himself above the law. He is using the technological tools of his son to enforce a reign of terror, showing that as human civilization grew in power, it also grew in its capacity for arrogance and violence. Literal breakdown. Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, begins with the expansion of Cain's family in the land of Nod. The text says Cain made love to his wife. The Hebrew verb here is yada, which literally means he knew her. This is the same word used for the intimate relationship between Adam and Eve. Despite being in exile, Cain is still participating in the biological mandate to be fruitful and multiply. The birth of his son Enoch, or Chanok, is significant because the name means dedicated or initiated. Cain then begins building a city using the word bana. This is the same verb used when God built the woman from the man's side. Literally, Cain is trying to build a world that is fixed and secure. He names the city after his son, which was a literal way of establishing a dynasty and a legacy that would outlast his own wandering. The genealogy in Genesis chapter 4, verse 18, moves quickly through 4 generations: Irad, Mehujael, Methushael, and Lamech. The names themselves are a mix of Hebrew roots that often refer to God, such as El. This shows that, even in the line of Cain, the language of the divine was still present. However, the narrative slows down once it reaches Lamech. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 19, we see a literal break from the creation pattern. Lamech took for himself 2 wives. The Hebrew phrase is yikach lo, which implies a taking for one's own pleasure. Their names are Ada, meaning ornament or beauty, and Zillah, meaning shadow or shimmer. Literally, the text is shifting the focus from the character of the women to their physical appearance. Genesis chapter 4, verses 20 through 22, describe the birth of specialized human culture. Lamech's 3 sons represent 3 literal breakthroughs. Jabal is the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. The word for livestock is mikneh, which refers to cattle as a form of movable wealth. Jubal is the father of all who play the kinnah, a stringed lyre, and the ugab, which was likely a flute or a pipe. Tubal-Cain is described as a lotesh. a sharpener, or a forger of every tool of bronze and iron. The word for tool here is choresh, which can mean a craft or a weapon. Literally, the text is showing that the line of Cain has moved from mere survival to the mastery of the physical and aesthetic world. The section concludes in Genesis chapter 4, verses 23 and 24, with the speech of Lamech. This is written as a formal Hebrew poem. Lamech calls his wives to listen, using the word shaman, which means to hear with attention. He boasts, "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me." The literal structure here is called synonymous parallelism, where the second line repeats and intensifies the first. He then references the divine protection given to Cain. He says if Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. The number 77 represents a literal infinity of vengeance. Lamech is taking the divine promise of protection and turning it into a personal license for unlimited violence. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual narrative of Genesis chapter 4, verses 17 through 24, is the story of the human attempt to rebuild paradise without God. When Cain builds a city, it is a spiritual declaration of independence. He was sentenced to be a restless wanderer, but he tries to use architecture to create his own rest. Spiritually, the city of Enoch represents the human effort to find security in walls and structures, rather than in the presence of the Lord. It teaches us that when we feel spiritually exposed, our natural instinct is to build something that makes us feel permanent and powerful. The rise of the arts and sciences in the line of Cain provides a profound spiritual lesson on what is called common grace. Even though this lineage is defined by rebellion and distance from Eden, God still allows them to discover the beauty of music and the utility of metalworking. Spiritually, this tells us that talent and technology are not indicators of a person standing with God. A person can be a master of the lyre, or a genius with bronze while being spiritually dead. This passage warns us not to mistake cultural sophistication for spiritual maturity. The ability to forge iron does not give a person the ability to forge a heart that is right with the Creator. The introduction of Lamech's 2 wives in Genesis chapter 4 verse 19 marks the spiritual decay of the marriage covenant. By taking 2 wives, Lamech is spiritually saying that the one flesh union established by God is not enough. He treats women as ornaments and shadows to be collected. This teaches us that once the vertical relationship with God is broken, the horizontal relationships between people inevitably become exploitative. Lamech's polygamy is a spiritual symptom of a heart that believes more is always better, leading to the devaluation of the individual. Lamech's sword song in Genesis chapter 4, verses 23 and 24, is the spiritual climax of the fall. While Cain was afraid of being killed, Lamech is proud of his ability to kill. He has taken the technological gift of his son, the forged metal, and turned it into a spiritual idol of power. Spiritually, Lamech represents the deification of the self. He believes he is so important that any slight against him deserves a 77-fold response. This is the spiritual opposite of the mercy God showed to Cain. It shows that when we walk away from God's grace, we eventually become our own judge, jury, and executioner. Finally, the spiritual meaning of this entire genealogy is the frightening speed at which sin progresses. In just 7 generations, humanity goes from the first murder to a culture that celebrates mass violence and the objectification of others. The line of Cain shows us what happens when human brilliance is untethered from divine wisdom. It creates a world that is beautiful to the ear and strong in the hand, but cold and murderous in the soul. This section leaves us with a spiritual cliffhanger, asking if there is any other way for the human story to continue, or if the land of Nod is the only future we have left. Genesis chapter 4, verses 25 through 26. Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. Historical context. The conclusion of Genesis chapter 4 offers a historical pivot from the violent and technologically advanced civilization of Cain back to the primary lineage of the promised offspring. In the 15th century before Christ, the Israelites would have viewed this transition as the birth of their own spiritual ancestry. After the rapid-fire genealogy of Cain's descendants, which focused on the construction of cities and the mastery of metals, the text slows down to record a birth that represents a restart for the human race. Historically, the names and actions in these two verses establish the formal beginning of what would become the community of faith. The naming of Seth in Genesis chapter 4, verse 25, reflects a historical return to a posture of gratitude rather than acquisition. When Eve named her firstborn Cain, she used language that emphasized her own role in getting a man. With Seth, she uses the word shath, which means to set or to appoint. She acknowledges that God has granted or appointed this child to her. In the ancient Near East, the appointing of a successor was a legal and royal act. By using this terminology, Eve is historically identifying Seth as the legitimate heir to the promise of the seed that was given in the previous chapter. Seth was not just a second choice. He was the divinely appointed replacement for the murdered Abel, ensuring that the history of humanity would not be defined solely by the line of the murderer. The birth of Enosh in Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, introduces a fascinating historical nuance regarding the human condition. The name Enosh is derived from a Hebrew root that implies frailty, mortality, or weakness. In the 15th century before Christ, most civilizations were obsessed with the idea of the God King or the immortal hero. The line of Cain reflected this by building cities and forging weapons to assert their power. The naming of Enosh, however, represents a historical moment where a segment of humanity acknowledged their own limitations. It was a recognition that humans are not gods, but are mortal beings who are dependent on a higher power. This name functioned as a humble counter-narrative to the arrogance of Lamech's sword song. Finally, the phrase at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord, marks the historical emergence of organized communal worship. In the ancient Near East, calling on the name of a deity involved more than just prayer. It was a formal, liturgical act. It meant invoking the name of the king to seek protection, to offer sacrifice, or to establish a covenant. While individuals like Abel had offered sacrifices before, this verse suggests the beginning of a public, collective, religious life. Historically, this tells us that as the world of Cain was developing its secular culture, the line of Seth was developing its spiritual culture. They were building an altar while Cain was building a city. This established a historical dualism between the two ways of being human, one defined by human strength and the other by the invocation of the divine name. Literal breakdown. Genesis chapter 4, verse 25, begins with a return to the primary narrative of the human family. The text says Adam made love to his wife again. As we have seen before, the Hebrew word here is yada, which signifies a deep, experiential knowing. Eve gives birth to a son and names him Seth. The name in Hebrew is Sheth. Eve explains the choice of this name by saying, "God has granted me another child in place of Abel." The word for granted is shath, which literally means to set, to place, or to appoint. This creates a powerful literal contrast with the name Cain. While Cain's name was linked to the word quana, meaning to acquire or get through human effort, Seth's name is linked to a word that describes a divine action. Seth is the one who is set or appointed by a power outside of the human will. The verse also uses the word takath, which means instead of, or in place of. This identifies Seth as the literal substitute for the murdered Abel. Interestingly, Eve uses the name Elohim for God in this verse, rather than the personal name Yahweh. Literarily, this might suggest a more formal or objective recognition of God's sovereignty over the events of life and death. She acknowledges that though Cain killed Abel, God has the final word by appointing a replacement. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, the lineage continues with the birth of Seth's son, Enosh. The name Enosh is a literal noun in Hebrew that refers to a human being, but it carries a specific connotation of being mortal, frail, or weak. It comes from a root word that can mean to be incurable or sickly. Literarily, this name marks a shift in how the line of Seth viewed themselves compared to the line of Cain. While Cain's descendants were naming themselves after concepts like beauty or shadow, Seth's line is defined by a recognition of human limitation. The chapter concludes with the phrase, "At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord." The Hebrew construction for call on is kara beishem. This is a technical liturgical phrase. It does not just mean to say a name aloud. It means to proclaim, to invoke, or to worship publicly. The name they are calling on is Yahweh, the personal covenantal name of God. Literarily, this serves as the conclusion to the entire 4th chapter. It sets up a binary world where one group of humans is building cities and weapons, while another group is building a community centered on the invocation of the divine presence. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual meaning of Genesis chapter 4, verse 25, is the reality of divine restoration. The story of humanity could have ended with the death of Abel and the exile of Cain. It could have been a story of a lost generation. But the arrival of Seth teaches us that God is a restorer of the broken line. Spiritually, Seth represents hope that is born out of tragedy. Eve's statement that God has granted her another child is a spiritual act of faith. She has moved past the pride of acquisition and into the humility of reception. She recognizes that life is not something she takes, but something God sets in place. This teaches us that even when our first efforts end in failure or violence, God is capable of appointing a new beginning. The naming of Enosh in Genesis chapter 4, verse 26 provides a profound spiritual lesson on the value of weakness. In a world that prizes strength, technology, and self-reliance, the world Cain was building, the name Enosh is a spiritual counterculture. It tells us that the beginning of true worship is the recognition of our own frailty. We are Enosh. We are mortal and limited. Spiritually, we cannot truly call on the name of the Lord until we realize that we cannot save ourselves. The line of Seth found its strength not in metalworking or city walls, but in the honest admission of their own mortality. The act of calling on the name of the Lord is the spiritual climax of the chapter. It highlights the difference between secular civilization and sacred community. While the line of Cain was calling on their own names and naming cities after their own sons, the line of Seth began to call on the name of Yahweh. This teaches us that our spiritual identity is defined by whose name we invoke in our times of need. Worship is the spiritual alternative to the violence of Lamech. Instead of boasting in our own ability to avenge ourselves 77 times, we are called to trust in the name that is above every name. Finally, the spiritual message of the end of Genesis chapter 4 is one of perseverance. It shows that even in a world that is becoming increasingly dark and violent, there is always a remnant of people who choose the path of prayer and dependence on God. The chapter ends not with a sword song, but with a prayer. This serves as a spiritual map for the reader. You can live in the land of Nod and trust in your own forged tools, or you can live in the line of Seth and find your security in the name of the Lord. It reminds us that no matter how advanced our civilization becomes, our greatest achievement will always be our return to the posture of worship.